Hello, today I will be talking about Vietnam War protests at UWSP, um, and why people were protesting the Vietnam War at UWSP is the question that I am asking with this project. So the lecture outline, I'm going to talk about who I am and why I'm doing this topic, uh, what can the images I show tell us, what the Vietnam War is, why were people protesting it, why were college students protesting it, and what's going on at UWSP and the counterculture newspaper and my sources and research. So we have a lot of things to cover. So why did I choose this topic and who am I? So, for starters, I'm a college student in a history of the public class at UWSP. It's a University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. So, for our final for the class, we needed to create a public history research project of a topic related to either our own local history or UWSP history. So, I chose this topic in particular because it all started when I found a bunch of pictures of protests of the Vietnam War in the digital photo archives. And they made me think of lots of questions. The main one being, why were people protesting the Vietnam War at UWSP? And here are some of the images that I found. I found a bunch of images. These are just the starting ones that I found. Later I found more through the archives. But you have images like this one where there's a police member and possible protester uh, having a conversation of some sort. You have marches and other protests with like marches like on this track field, and here's another possible march or protest of some sort, another march. Here's a protest with signs about the the ROTC, and here's some gatherings possibly to talk about protests. Uh, you can see college students, possible members of the public or staff members like here and here. Just very interesting photos. Here's another one at the track meet, probably a similar protest. Here's one outside of a building. Here's one with signs down here, and another one with signs. And a very interesting part about these images is reading all the signs and the things they wear can tell us a lot about the types of things they're protesting. Like this one right here is about the ROTC, which is like military type club of some sort where you do military things. Uh, this one says ROTC is not mandatory freedom of choice, so it's probably an anti-draft protest because the ROTC is related to the military and a lot of the protests were around the draft. And here's some. This one says stuff about guns. This one says stuff about the draft. This one says power to the people. So you can just see lots of interesting things, even based on what these signs say, what kind of clothes they're wearing, like in these ones, uh, what they're doing, like in the marches, in this one with the cop, uh, these motions in this one. They can all tell us very interesting things and raise very interesting questions. So, yeah. So, what can these photos tell us about the past? Here's the photo from that intro slide. They can tell us about the types of people involved in events and protests. What types of people, ages, races, walks of life, etc. For example, in this one, you could see probably a lot of college students, but you can also see kids like here on the bicycle and one in the back. So maybe there's people's families at these protests. You can also see people of different races in this protest. So it's obviously not just like a single race-based protest. You can tell You can tell what they're protesting because of this sign. It says, I can't read that top word, but peace in Vietnam. You know, you can definitely tell it's a Vietnam protest. You can tell it's in front of a United States post office building in Stevens Point, so you can tell where. So, like over here, it says you can tell what is happening. Obviously, they're doing a protest, and it gives us a glimpse into that past event. Obviously, with this image, it can be very powerful. It shows us the what's and where of an event of the past. The what being a protest, the where being in front of this postal office building. Um, it can also show us visual trends over time, fashion, what types of protesting, all that, buildings, The pictures can make past events feel more real and easier to conceptualize or like connect to because we can see real people in that past event. They can help us really empathize and learn about the past in unique ways because obviously it's a picture of a real person, so it feels a little bit more substantial and real. So yeah. So you might be wondering, why were there Vietnam War protests at UWSP? This is the question that we are trying to break down, uncover, really figure out why this is happening. So we gotta start with what is the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War was a war in which the U.S. was trying to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam. Obviously, this is a very simplified summary of the war and all its goals. It was a very long war. It lasted from 1945 to 1975. Yes, 30-year war, so it was very long. There was a lot of other goals, but the main goal was to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam. It was between the U.S. and Vietnam, to be specific. It was also known as the War with No End for how long it lasted. Um, it is seen as one of the most controversial wars in U.S. history for the treatment of U.S. soldiers, the brutality and lives lost, and the reasons for even joining the war to begin with. Um, the controversies with this war don't end with the war itself, however, but also with the mistreatment of veterans that were injured physically or mentally during the war. So, additionally, with just how messed up this war was. The treatment of veterans after the war was also a thing that was heavily protested. So, what are some more reasons why people were against this war? Um, well, for one, the main thing that people were protesting was the draft. Even in these signs, you can see some stuff about the draft, withdrawing, vets against the war. Lots of interesting types of protest signs. You can even see reasons for protesting the war. So some reasons why: the draft, civil rights and peace movements, treatment of the soldiers and civilians of Vietnam, obviously the brutality of the war, reasons for fighting the war, treatments of veterans, etc. The draft was one of the major reasons, obviously, but those who did not have to worry as much about losing their job were at advantage for protesting the war. So obviously that would be college students because they're in college, clergy, pacifists, activists, writers, people who didn't have as much worry about getting fired had a unique opportunity. Additionally, women had unique opportunities in protesting the Vietnam War as they were exempt from the draft. Um, so this offered them a unique opportunity to protest, but they still could be fired. So there's obviously pros and cons. So why specifically were college students um, a big factor in protests for this war? Well, for one, they were exempt from the draft. So obviously, if you're exempt from the draft, you would have a unique opportunity in terms of protesting the war. Um, they didn't have to worry as much from being fired from their job, obviously, because they were in college. Additionally, professors played an important role as leaders of demonstrations and movements on campuses, but they were not protected from job termination, of course. You can see probably a professor right here leading this discussion around protest. Obviously, you could probably see some more older adults that might have been professors or something of the such. This book right here, Campus Wars, really details a lot of this protesting history during the Vietnam War era on college campuses, and I definitely would recommend it if you want to learn more about the peace movements across the United States. It's a very interesting read. So, what things were going on at UWSP during the war? For one, there was 3 presidents of the college that had different things that I thought were notable happening during this Vietnam War era. For one, you had William C. Hansen. He was from 1940 to 1962. His presidency was mostly affected during or by the World War I, of course. But there was a college military training department during his time, which I thought was quite notable to put in here. James H. Elberson was from 1962 to 1964. He was young, ambitious, and politically active with Vietnam, but not fighting, just in terms of politics. And he died in 1967, so quite the short term compared to some of the other presidents and chancellors. And then there's Lee Sherman Dreyfus. He served from 1967 to 1977, and much of the protests and sit-ins over the war in Vietnam occurred during his presidency. So he's quite notable for that. Many of the pictures of protests that have been documented. There's a lot of photographs of protests, which I thought was really interesting. UWSP has quite the rich, well-documented photographic history in terms of protests. UWSP has a rich history of counterculture and protests that even in some ways still occurs today, just not in the same ways, of course, as during this era. An interesting book, if you want to know more about specific UWSP history, is this one up here, The World Is Ours. It goes through very detailed history of UWSP from the 1890s to the 1990s. So basically about 100 years of UWSP history in this book. Well, actually more than 100 years, almost. But yeah, lots of UWSP history is encapsulated in this book. So it's very interesting. So that brings us to one of the most important sources. One of the most important sources to consider when you're talking about UWSP related things, and that is the Pointer, because it has been around so long. The Pointer is a college newspaper here at UWSP that still runs today. It's been running a very long time. It covers many topics, but mostly ones of things going on campus and such. It's notable because it's not a political newspaper, so it really shows that this was an important topic to either the creators of the newspaper or to college students in general. This is the only mention I could find of Vietnam War related stuff in this mainstream newspaper at the college. It was the 1970 October 29th issue, and they obviously mention Vietnam GIs oppose the war, and they talk about some people that oppose the Vietnam War. And this is really notable because this is not a political newspaper. So it shows that this was either really important to the creators, of course, like I said, or the public. So it's very notable that this is being talked about in the mainstream newspaper. And that brings us to the actual most important. I almost mixed it up with the other one. The Counterpoint newspaper. The Counterpoint was a counterculture political newspaper that started during the Vietnam War era. It acts as almost a history of protests and counterculture at UWSP in a way. It ran from 1968 to 1970, and it has 19 documented issues in the archives. I'm not sure whether there's more, but there's only 19 that are documented, so I'm assuming there's only 19. Each issue talks about something counterculture related, but features some local politics as well of counterculture and just things happening. The very first issue has mentions of the Vietnam War. I think up here is even a little chunk from the first issue that I screenshotted and added. It this newspaper really answers the question of why this was happening here at UWSP. There was a big existing counterculture movement that was evident through the pictures of protests and these newspapers. It, things were the counterculture was quite evident here, so that is why uh, protests were happening here in Wisconsin at this college. Um, these newspapers cover everything and anything counterculture and non-mainstream related, so it's easier to examine how these topics of focus changed over time by looking at the covers. Some of the covers feature art, things related to politics, or even pictures of real people. So it's very interesting to examine these covers. So here, how we're going to examine how these covers have changed over time by looking at all of them. So here's the first three covers. We got the first one starting in 1968, of course, and then I think all of these are still in 1968. So we got some images of real people in all of these. This one obviously has a lot of specific UWSP related pictures, as it looks like, possibly. This has some politicians. We have some interesting like handwritten text and even illustrations on the one on the right here. So you can tell what they're focusing on these issues in terms of what they put on the covers. This one focuses on Nixon. This one focuses on these real pictures of protests, and this one focuses on impeachment central. So obviously, this one probably focuses on impeachment. So these next issues are really interesting to me because they have more standing out images. They're very eye-catching, especially this one on the right with all the color. It's one of the most colorful issues of the pointer. So you could tell these issues, they're trying to make them more eye-catching to grab people's attention and really get them curious about what these issues are saying. This one obviously is very artful. Same with the one on the right. The right and the left are very artful. The middle one has a picture of MLK, so they're very eye-catching and interesting. These next ones are even more illustrated, featuring art pieces with real people going on, which is really interesting. And this middle one is almost like they're trying to redraw an old newspaper to catch people in, so that's interesting as well. Talks about a new college president, and there's some pictures of real people on this one on the right too. It's just very interesting. This one talks about sex and birth control and such. So it's really interesting to see what each of these issues focus on. These ones, it gets even more artful almost as time goes on. It goes on and off from artful and real pictures. This one is very gorgeous. It's got an illustration of a person and the atmosphere of art. You can tell how these issues are starting to focus on like art related stuff in conjunction to political related stuff, which is really interesting. This one's got like a dude with some really interesting hair. I don't know if this is supposed to be a specific person or not, to be honest, but this one might be focusing on music because you can see a bunch of musicians, so maybe he's supposed to be a musician. So you can see music in the counterculture movement. So yeah, that's really interesting. Music and art in the counterculture is very interesting to note, of course. These ones are like this one's obviously like a art piece almost. You could see a bunch of little lettering that says counterpoint, that says censored. It's really eye-catching, bold. One makes you want to read it. This one's very like almost like a standard newspaper, but still interesting. It's got a bunch of like it gets right into it. I don't know if they were missing the cover of this one or if this is just the cover and they went a little less artful for this one. This one is very like black heavy, but uh, it says back from the dead. So I don't know if they took a little break for a bit and came back, but it's like all blocked out with black, and then you could see these chunks of interesting text that talk about political activism. So that's interesting. This one's got a guy leaning on it, which I think might be a chancellor, but I'm not sure because it says it might just be a dude doing his thing. It might discuss it in the issue, but definitely talks about some sole purpose of the student. So yeah, it talks about some specific UWSP stuff, and here's an art piece where it has a bunch of hashed out lines, and it says each one of these 40,000 lines represents a U.S. soldier killed in Vietnam. So this is a specific art piece related to Vietnam right on the cover. And here's the last 3 issues. This one has some real people, an interesting text. This one has some soldiers down here and some dogs. So this one, you can tell they're really just getting the business with it. They want to have this be bold, and they want to get into the meat and potatoes and really talk about it must be like acting out for protest, or very much like we need to talk about this. And interestingly enough, this one on the right is one of the last documented issues, and it has like pictures of death and such. And I honestly really like this one. It says, "Earth is finite, greed is infinite." So honestly, it must be talking. It's talking about war, uh, waste, war, overpopulation, pollution. So it's like those like biblical death related stuff, and it's about protecting the earth and that. So it's really interesting to see what these issues, or these these issues of this magazine focus on over time. So what do these covers tell us? They can tell us about the active political scene on campus. They can tell us about political statements and what they're trying to say. They can give us insight into the counterculture movement here with the real images of people. They can tell us the importance of art and even art. They can tell us about the importance of making these covers bold, so it makes people want to read them. They can tell us about maybe some of the humor that is used. And they can show us how creative individuals aided in these counterculture movements. And it can give us insight into some of the topics covered, as with the little captions and art and all that. So yeah, it can just tell us some really interesting things about this newspaper and how it related to the larger counterculture movement. So that's all, but I'll tell you guys about some of my research. I took a lot of notes on all my sources. I found 3 photo databases, 2 through UWSP, and one of just National Archive of photos of the Vietnam War to use on my Vietnam War page. And I found the Pointer, of course, that one article, the Pointer, and obviously all the issues of the Counterpoint. So lots of primary sources of photos and newspapers. And additionally, I found 4 books on the topic. These 2 books on the Vietnam War, just for some general context of the topic, and this book, Campus Wars, on the peace movement of American state colleges and universities in the Vietnam War era. So that's obviously good context of just how colleges related to these bigger counterculture movements and such. And this one for context of UWSP history in general. So yeah, it was a very interesting project to research. And if you want to learn anything more about the topic, feel free to look at any of these sources, because you'll find so much about the Vietnam War and counterculture and the counterculture movement on college campuses, and how it can be how college campuses can be very important in this counterculture movement and anti-Vietnam War movement. So yeah, thank you for listening.